Good afternoon, everybody. This is Paul Lewis with the Eno Center for Transportation. Thank you for tuning in. This is our webinar for the month of December. We're going to be talking about the Dockless revolution and what we're learning from shared mobility. We've invited Regina Clewlow. She is the CEO and co-founder of a company called Populus. That group takes real-time data streams from transit and bikes and scooters and everything else on the road now, and integrates that into a platform that cities can use to make policy and planning decisions. The interesting thing to me is that she and her team spends their day totally immersed in mobility data. And so we've asked her to take some time out of her day and her job to tell us some of the kind of big picture and small picture insights that she and her team have learned looking at this data, and specifically about the Dockless and micromobility things that we're seeing pop up on streets all over the country and all over the world. So how this is going to work is I'm going to turn it over to Regina here in a minute. She's going to go through a couple slides that she has, and you should all be able to see that via the webinar. And then we've reserved the last 15 minutes or so of this 30-minute webinar for questions. So during this webinar, if and when you have questions, please enter them into the chat function. You'll see the chat function on your GoToWebinar control panel, and you can use that to submit questions, and I'll go through those and hopefully get to everybody's questions before we run out of time. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Regina, and we'll hear what she has to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you to the Eno Center for having me join their webinar series. I'm very excited to present on what I think is one of the most interesting transportation topics of 2018, the explosion of micromobility services, and how interestingly this has led to cities now having greater access to new sources of data for transportation and planning. As Paul mentioned, the Populus team is now working with cities from coast to coast. We ingest real-time data from multiple major mobility operators to help cities make decisions around policy and planning around new mobility services as they arrive. Next slide. Next slide. As some of you may know, the team at Populus has been really active in delivering shared mobility data and information to the public sector for the past 6 years in various roles, including previously as research scientist at UC Berkeley, Davis, and Stanford. And for the past 10 years, our team's been building software for cities, regional agencies, and federal agencies, primarily to forecast and plan for the future of travel. This was really the genesis for our team forming Populus to build solutions that could help shared mobility operators in cities work more seamlessly together through better data. One of the key challenges is that shared mobility has rapidly evolved over the last 20 years. Our CTO and myself were working on the software to simulate San Francisco Bay Area regional travel back in 2012 and 2013. And it was then that I started to see that these services, private services, were growing at a pretty rapid clip. And we, as transportation forecasters for the Bay Area, had basically no information about them. And this was a bit problematic because we were building forecasting tools upon which fairly long and major policy and transportation decisions were being made. Next slide. So I started collecting data on the adoption and use of mobility services back in 2012, including car sharing, ride hailing, bike sharing. And then in 2018, the electric scooter craze began, and we produced a report back in July called the Micromobility Revolution, which you're welcome to download. It's now officially a peer-reviewed TRB paper. And what we were finding is that the adoption of these services is rapidly accelerating. And for scooters specifically, we were already seeing that in most major metros, about 3.5% of the population already were using those services. And I've seen some stats recently that show that in some areas, it's now already up to 7% or higher. There are a couple of semi-obvious reasons that have led to rapid growth of micromobility. The first being that GPS-enabled smartphone adoption has grown from 35% in 2011 to 77% in 2018. So just to put that in perspective, when Uber and Lyft first launched, only a third or so of people had access to smartphones. And now that number is probably close to 100% in most major US metros like New York, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. The second reason is that traffic continues to get worse in most major US cities, and it's faster in many cases to bike or scooter trips that are 3 miles or less, which make up almost half of all the trips in the United States. And the third is that micromobility companies have raised huge amounts of venture capital, and with that money, they've been able to invest in huge supply, which has in turn influenced demand. So it's not surprising that we would see pretty quick growth in the adoption of these services. Next slide. I mentioned in our introduction that when the Populus team was building software to forecast Bay Area travel, we had no data on new mobility services. And I think that there's a critical problem, with that scenario. Ultimately, the public sector, specifically cities and regional agencies, are responsible for looking out for the common good, including, prioritizing making progress on safety, reducing transportation-related injuries and fatalities, ensuring equitable access to transportation. That is, we don't want to leave behind historically underserved populations as mobility services continue to evolve, and efficiency. So not only reducing traffic congestion, but also promoting policies that can curb the continued growth of energy use and climate impacts of transportation. And at the end of the day, if we expect to make progress on these goals, cities need access to data. Otherwise, they're simply unable to develop truly effective policies and transportation plans that can help us make progress towards them. Next slide. So what happened? I think we might have skipped one slide if we can go back. Oh, no, here we are. Can you go back one slide? Great. So in 2018, it seems cities have been able to make significant progress on requiring access to data for new mobility services that are launched under the regulatory authority. Why is it that micromobility has been so easy for cities to regulate? There are a couple of key reasons. First, fleets are owned by typically only a handful of operators. The vehicles themselves are relatively small. The vehicles are stationary for a portion of time. That is, they're left on sidewalks or in curb space for people to check out and ride. And so they're really easy to confiscate. And so there were a handful of cities in the early days that developed dockless mobility permits that really replicated across the country, including, in particular, the provision of data from operators to cities. Next slide. I'm not going to go into too much detail on what most dockless mobility permits look like, but at a high level, they usually contain key safety requirements, general parking restrictions, data sharing requirements, and then some sort of fee structure. Next slide. And what we're going to focus on now are the data sharing requirements and how that data is being used by cities for policy and planning. Next slide. So first, most cities are requiring a couple of common data points from operators, including trips, vehicles, maintenance logs, complaints, and a record of injuries. And second, what's really interesting is that we've seen the evolution of data specifications over the past year, where now cities are starting to request the data through industry-wide standards. There are two to be aware of. The GBFS, General Bike Feed Specification, which was originally developed as a way for docked bike share operators to deliver information about where vehicles were located to consumers, and then potentially to make that data open through APIs that other apps could share vehicle locations for. And then this fall, Los Angeles Department of Transportation introduced the Mobility Data Specification, which is much more focused on an operator to agency or city focused data sharing, where micromobility operators can share data with cities, including most notably and importantly, historical trip and route data. And then finally, within the data sharing realm, many cities also want information on the demographics of who is using these services. Are there scooter trips, new trips, or are they replacing walking, biking, transit, or trips that would have been made by a personal vehicle? And this is information that is very difficult to ascertain from GPS data. So many cities are asking operators to deploy surveys that are consistent and that have been rigorously vetted internally by the city, which is something that Populus has a significant experience doing. Next slide. So at a high level, this transition is really interesting in the micromobility space, but extends beyond that because it isn't just about dockless bikes and scooters, but it's really about cities beginning to transition towards active mobility management. For those of you who aren't aware, the TRB just established a new committee that's holding its first meeting next week, including a public forum that will address the issue of how public agencies can play more of an active role in how our streets are utilized, particularly in light of the growth of shared mobility and what people view as the inevitable arrival someday of autonomous vehicles. Next slide. But in the near term, what cities have been really successful getting in 2018 is their hands on lots and lots of shared scooter and bike data. So what can you do with this data, and what are we seeing in our work with cities? Well, first, one of the most important questions that cities have is whether or not these services are providing equitable access in low-income neighborhoods, predominantly minority neighborhoods, or other communities of concern. And one of the simplest ways that most cities have looked at this question is by drawing specific geographic boundaries in which they might require that a certain percentage of dockless scooters or bikes be placed in, and usually monitoring that just during the morning hours when most operators really have the most control over where they place vehicles. What's great about cities now having access to this type of data is that they can design policy such as equitable placement or an incentive, and then instantly begin monitoring whether or not vehicles are being placed in those areas and whether or not trips are occurring. And if they aren't, then they can develop new programs and policies that might provide, for instance, a subsidy, and then monitor whether or not those subsidies are actually effective at promoting additional access. Next slide. Next slide. So the Populus team produced a report last month on measuring equitable access to new mobility, where we presented some of the key best practices that we've seen in different cities. And then in it, we also performed some slightly more complex equity analysis by evaluating the average distance to a bike or scooter for every street intersection and presenting that visually and looking at the data. Next slide. And what you can see is that here in Ward 8 in Washington, D.C., which is traditionally underserved, it's actually easier to access a dockless e-bike or scooter within a shorter distance than the pre-existing docked bike share system. And furthermore, the analysis of utilization rates of the existing capital bike share system and the utilization rates of the new dockless services suggests that the new dockless program isn't cannibalizing the existing system that the city is investing in. It's actually so far pretty complementary. And this is really a win-win. In this circumstance, people in underserved areas now have greater access to new mobility services that weren't there in, as great a form as they could have been. And DC's recently increased the vehicle caps for their dockless program to reach, I believe, 600 vehicles per operator, and then also per vehicle type. So if an operator has bikes and scooters, they can have 600 of each potentially. Next slide. I mentioned MDS, the Mobility Data Specification, earlier. It's only within the past few months that cities have started to get route data, that is GPS trace data for dockless bike and scooter trips. And what's really exciting about this is that now city transportation planners have access to a wealth of data that they can use to start expanding infrastructure for bikes, e-bikes, and scooters. I personally think that this is one of the biggest and most important shifts in the conversation around new mobility, because based on the adoption figures that we've seen for electric scooters, we suddenly have a huge number of people, a larger number of constituents than we ever had before, that are demanding better bike lanes, combined with the data to back up where those improvements can be made. It's really exciting, and I hope that cities and mobility operators are able to really harness this opportunity to come together to expand the amount of physical space in cities that we start to dedicate towards pedestrians, bikes, and of course, scooters. Next slide. Next slide. We recently announced a new partnership with Lime, where we're now taking in real-time data. Next slide.
Hold on, we had the PowerPoint froze on us. We're relaunching it. Hold on just a second.
Okay.
There we go.
So we recently announced a new partnership with Lime where we're now taking in real-time data from a shared fleet of cars in order to validate use of on-street parking. As I mentioned earlier, although cities have been very effective in obtaining access to scooter and bike data, ultimately what they're really interested in is more active mobility management as a way to allocate more efficiently access to public space. As cities continue to become more crowded and as new mobility services continue to arrive, including eventually autonomous vehicles, cities are looking to take more of an active role. And one of the ways they can do that is with access to better data, real-time data, and the pricing of physical space. One of the things that we're going to be looking at is curbside utilization. We know that many shared fleets actually use public space more efficiently. That is, they're delivering more trips for more people. And when cities have access to better data, they can then justify carving off on-street parking that may be used for stationary vehicles, personally owned vehicles that sit there for the majority of the day, and allocate that space for docked scooter or dockless scooter parking or shared vehicle parking. And so we think this is a really exciting opportunity going forward. And we're looking forward to continuing to work with cities and operators to deliver some of these solutions and think about how the city becomes more dynamic now with access to greater sources of data. Next slide. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions for the remainder of the webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you, Regina. As you were talking, we had a bunch of questions come in. Again, for folks on the webinar, to ask a question, all you need to do is to go to the questions function on the GoToWebinar control panel and type your question in there. I'm going to try to get through everybody's. We already have a few dozen, so I'm going to go through just a couple quick ones, Regina. At the very beginning, we had a couple questions about your 3.6% of the population that has used e-scooters. What does that exactly refer to? And does that filter out single-time users or people that are using it regularly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we collect data in major metros that are statistically representative of the population. And what we've found is that if you look at a major metro at the metropolitan statistical area, and this varies by region, but overall for all the regions that we've sampled, which represent about half of the US population, we found that 3.6% of people have used them ever. We also have additional data on how frequently they used different types of services, including ride-hailing, car sharing, docked bike share, dockless scooters and bikes. And so we have additional reports that we provide that provide more detail on the more nuanced questions that cities and agencies might have.
Yeah, and I think some of the nuanced questions are coming through here in the webinar. One that popped up a couple times actually is, are scooter trips replacing walking trips, car trips, T&C trips? I mean, what have you been able to deduce from the data?
So there are a couple of ways that one can look at that. One is that you can look at the distribution of trip lengths and make some assumptions about what you think those trips are replacing, and also aggregate additional sources of data that are publicly available to determine where the shifts are occurring. What we also do at Populus is do basically post-intercept surveys. So we ask people for their last trips, what they would have done otherwise, or what are the substitutions they're making. I've done previous research in that area around ride-hailing services and how they substitute for other forms of transport. But I think it's a mix. I mean, they are definitely substituting for walk trips. They are generating new trips. People think they're fun to ride and are riding them. And we also know from survey data that people are also changing their complete journey. So just as an example, I know our CTO, we moved into a new office. He was going to have to start potentially driving. And then Jump arrived, and there were lots of new e-bikes that were available. So now it's easier for him to take the Transbay bus over and then hop on a Jump bike. So there are complete journeys that are also changing as a result of these services serving first and last mile.
A question that's come up a couple times is about the data on safety. How do scooters compare to bikes, compare to other modes in terms of safety, and what trends, good or bad, have you been seeing on the safety front?
So we actually don't have a lot of data directly on safety yet. We know that a lot of cities are starting to collect that data through reporting from operators to them. And then we have cities and have tools that allow cities to track that data through a public-facing method to directly collect that data and provide more transparency to the city. There's a new study, I believe, that the CDC is going to be doing in Austin to look at that question. I do think there are clearly some key safety issues that are going to need to be addressed, and some of them can be addressed with hardware, and some of them can be addressed with changes in behavior, for instance, ensuring people are riding them in the correct place. But finally, a key issue is really that cities are going to need to think about how we design more safe infrastructure for people to use bikes and scooters on our streets.
Got it. And one question that's also come up, and this is more related to Populus, but where are you getting and accessing these data sources? Where are your sources coming from?
So what we've seen is that the vast majority of cities that develop a new mobility operating permit for Dockless micromobility bikes and scooters are requiring that those operators share data with them. And we're now working with cities from coast to coast that then use Populus as a third party to analyze that data. So that's primarily where our data is coming from. And we also collect our own data, and that's a separate product that we developed earlier this year based on our previous work in the transportation space that focused primarily on developing good travel survey data sets and using them for forecasting the future of transportation.
Got it. So you had a slide about common micromobility data requirements. Is there consistent data sharing agreements, and is there a need for the industry and cities to come together to have some kind of consistency on data, or is the current system working right now kind of on an ad hoc basis?
Well, I'll separate that into kind of two key parts. We now have the mobility data specification, which was introduced by LADOT. And we are finding that that is now serving as a standard that cities feel comfortable adopting. And basically, you can think of it as a dictionary that defines what are the key variables that should be delivered and what exactly do we mean when we say a trip or a vehicle ID. But a separate piece of that is, the permit and the policy and the uses of the data. And there isn't as much consistency. But I do think that eventually over time, it's a quickly evolving space, there will be and there is a need for more standardization on how the data is treated and used, and as well as on the policy side, what might be contained in a permit.
Got it. An interesting question here from somebody who says they're with a transit agency and they're looking for some specific examples of best practices of dockless mobility partnerships with transit agencies.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really early now. There haven't been a ton of partnerships yet, but when you look to, for instance, free floating car sharing, there are a number of examples where free floating car sharing services have developed partnerships where they have access to parking, as an example. So I think that there are huge opportunities for first and last mile around dockless micromobility solutions. And there are a lot of previous examples in the free floating car sharing space that transit agencies can look to.
Got it. So another question, what proportion of a city's travel or a metro area falls in the range of what could be used as like with a scooter or a bike? Is it a large portion of trips overall could be on a scooter or bike, or is it most trips much longer than that? Maybe it's a 3 miles or less category.
So based on our analysis of the most recent National Household Travel Survey, 45% of trips in the U.S. are 3 miles or less. So almost 50%. And the majority of those are currently made in a personal vehicle. I believe the number is 78%.
Got it. Does that change if you get into a larger city, or is that a kind of nationwide number?
That's a nationwide number. There's definitely a lot of variation, which is
Sure.
why we collect a lot of local data at the MSA level and also more in the urban cores as well. Because what you'll see is that the number of trips that are 3 miles or less increases, but also the percentage of trips that are made in a personally owned vehicle decreases, and there are increasing numbers of trips that are made on public transit or in services like Uber and Lyft.
Okay, here's another question. You mentioned that there's a huge new constituency that's demanding abundant bike lanes and new safe infrastructure. How do we pay for it? And is there a role for micromobility companies to help pay for some of that new infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we've seen is that most cities are thinking about that, as well as some of the mobility operators themselves. And so through, for instance, the mobility permits that cities have approved, they typically institute fees. It typically includes a flat fee to operate and a per vehicle fee to operate. And what cities are looking at those fees as covering are their ability to oversee the management of the program and evaluate it. There's obviously staff time that's involved in evaluation, but also, and then dedicating some of those resources to expanding bike and scooter infrastructure, including lanes, but also including places where those vehicles can be parked.
Got it. So I've got a question here. Can you talk a little more about the map that you had on the LimePod slide and explain what types of information you're showing in the map and how cities can use it to make better decisions? And we'll backtrack to that slide if that's all right.
Yep.
Yeah, this one.
So what we're doing is taking real-time vehicle location data and mapping it to curb rules. So there are certain policies in most cities about how the curb is utilized, in particular parking policies. So for certain hours of the day, certain pricing schemes that are in place, and we're validating the use of that space. But secondly, many cities are interested in thinking about how that physical space is used. And so for shared vehicle trips, whether they be in cars or scooters or bikes, you can actually quite easily track, how many trips are being delivered by virtue of allowing a vehicle to use that physical space. And so we're going to be doing a study with a university partner on curbside utilization to take a look at how cities can then think about new strategies for curbside management.
Got it. I know we're closing in here at 4:30 Eastern, 1:30 Pacific, so we're gonna probably cut it off here in just a minute. And I've got one more question, but I just want to let folks on the webinar know that if we didn't get to your question, we'll follow up with you, or you can certainly send me an email or reach out to me on Twitter, and we can make sure that we're answering your questions. This is a start of, I think, a much longer conversation that we're going to be having on the micromobility space. Obviously there's a lot going on here. And Regina, my last question is kind of looking to the future. 12 months ago, we had dockless bikes all over American cities, and that's proved to be more of a fad than anything, and now it's dockless scooters, and that seems to have a little bit more staying power. But I want your thoughts. Is what is the fad or the future of micromobility? I mean, what do you see coming up? What is the landscape going to look like in 12 months?
So I'm optimistic, and I think that in the Netherlands, they had a movement many years ago with people calling out for more pedestrian and bike-friendly infrastructure because we were seeing a significant number of increases in the deaths of children getting hit by cars. And there was a giant campaign, and cities redesigned streets. And most people think of the Netherlands as like the Mecca for bikes. I think this could be our moment in the U.S. and many cities where you have lots of people who are excited about using these services. Ironically, they had a different sort of campaign in the Netherlands. And the U.S., we have scooters. And so I think it's really up to cities and mobility operators to figure out how to partner with each other to really change how we use our streets. And if we can figure out how to do that, then I think they're here to stay.
Fantastic. I like it. Hey, thanks, Regina, for joining us. Thanks, everybody, for dialing in. Again, we'll look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks, Regina.
Thanks, Paul.